It's time for The World This Week. 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. We're pleased to be in the company of Vivian Walt, contributor to Time magazine. How are you?
Very good.
We're also pleased to welcome back Judah Grunstein of World Politics Review, which you can find at
worldpoliticsreview.com.
All right. And we love visitors, and we have 2 of them today, distinguished ones. Michael Young, who's been a guest on the debate in the past, opinion editor of Lebanon's Daily Star, leading English-language newspaper there. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks as well to Delphine Minoui, Cairo-based Middle East correspondent for French broadsheet Le Figaro, and whose latest book, Je vous écris de Téhéran, I'm writing to you from Tehran, chronicles your 12 years it was working in the Iranian capital, and you wrote it as a tribute letter, a love letter, we could say, to your departed grandfather.
To my grandfather, who was Iranian indeed.
All right, and let's hope it's translated soon into English. The World This Week, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter, our hashtag F24Debate. 2 months after Paris, 1 after Copenhagen, this time it was Tunis and the storming of the great Bardo Antiquities Museum by 2 Libya-trained jihadists killed by security forces after they mowed down 21, most of them tourists, on a cruise. The museum adjacent to Tunisia's parliament, where lawmakers were discussing a new anti-terror bill. The attack later claimed by ISIS, a first on Tunisian soil. Now this Friday, Independence Day in Tunisia, commemorations on Bourguiba Avenue, a somber affair this time around, in stark contrast to the scenes of jubilation 4 years ago at the start of the Arab Spring.
Killing people this way is really terrible and unacceptable, whatever the attackers' ideas are.
It's wrong that people from other countries come here to get away from it all on holiday, to see our culture, and then they are killed. It's sad.
It's more important than ever right now to show solidarity with the foreigners and the Tunisians that are experiencing this crisis, because what the terrorists want is for us to be at home and be scared and not come to Tunisia.
Not come to Tunisia. Vivian Walt, I know it's a country you've reported on and love. Do you see yourself going on vacation to Tunisia?
I would say yes. I mean, in the sense that, you know, tourists are still going to the Sinai in Egypt. There are clearly, this is a region that is, you know, directly affected by what's been happening in Syria and Iraq and Libya. I mean, one can't be naive about that. But clearly, it's going to take a lot of reassurance for Westerners to go back there in any numbers, I would say.
Cruise liners canceling Tunis as a port of call.
Absolutely, and so they should. I mean, I'm sure their insurance premiums went through the roof in the last couple of days, and you simply can't reassure that number of tourists that they ought to go visit Tunis just because they feel good about the place. There are many, many other countries to go visit.
And remind for us, Tunisia, how it really stands out when you look at the events of the last 4 years.
Well, it's clearly the only country of the 4 Arab Spring revolts. We're talking, you know, Syria, Libya, Tunisia, Yemen. It's the only one that vaguely resembles a functioning democracy, and it certainly does resemble that, more or less. It has an elected president now, an elected parliament. I mean, compared to every other country, including the 2 that it's wedged between, Algeria and Libya, it stands out as a kind of moderate, tolerant, open place, as it always did for many years. It just has another side to it and deep fault lines, which kind of came exploding open this week.
Michael Young, have we played up too much Tunisia's bill as poster child for the Arab Spring gone right, or is that the reason why it was the target?
Well, I don't think you can really say you've played it up too much. I mean, Tunisia is indeed a success story. It came out with a very interesting constitution last year. No, I mean, I think Tunisia is now the question is that why they were attacked? Perhaps. I mean, I really don't know what the motivation is behind this attack, but clearly there is something that disturbed the extremists that led them to conduct this attack.
Delphine Minuit?
It feels like they really hit a symbol. As you said, Tunisia was the last hope in this region. It's also the country where finally...
Was the last hope?
That's what we feel, and it's also a country where Islamist and secular politicians managed to find a sort of coalition and to team up together to build up some sort of post-democratic process. And let's go back to the symbol of the Bardo Museum. You know, when we know that in other countries, ISIS is hitting also the patrimoine, the architecture, what's left from the past. And also, ironically, it happened in the same time as just next door, the parliament was meeting, the members of parliament were meeting to talk about how to find a good security system, because Tunisia, as we all know, has a long border with Libya. And we all know as well that I think around 3,000 Tunisians went to fight the jihad in Syria, and 300 of them came back to Tunisia.
And the attackers, the local authorities saying they were trained in Libya, Judah Grunstein.
One other thing that I wanted to add to what everyone said is that if Tunisia has been a success story so far, it's because every time where things looked like they were going to go to the brink, everyone managed to pull back, whether it was the old guard or the secularists or the Islamists, and managed to put the survival of the political project of an emerging democracy above their personal interests and their particular interests. And so just comparing it to, for instance, what happened here in France at the time of the Charlie Hebdo attacks, a lot of people were very worried because France also has been very politically polarized, and they were very worried that in hitting this sort of leverage point that could be very easily used, for instance, by the far right, that it might actually have a dramatic impact on French politics in a negative way. It actually happened that it was the reverse that happened. France came together and managed to show unity. So I think in some ways the question for Tunisia moving forward is, will all the parties be able to pull back from the brink, or will this be the sort of tipping point that hits the raw nerve and begins to harden people's positions and make them more apt to go after each other as opposed to cooperating.
Vivian Walt, as Judah was saying, it's been a roller coaster ride these last 4 years for Tunisia since they overthrew their strongman of 2 decades. Did you have a sense, covering those events, that it was touch and go, or that Tunisia has a stronger backbone than it seems?
You know, Tunisia's always been a kind of somewhat schizophrenic place. I mean, it's almost like you can see in Tunisia what you want to see in it. It's a lovely, you know, open, somewhat westernized place, and it's also got a whole other side. And I remember being there, for example, right after they attacked the U.S. Embassy in 2012. And when you spoke to, and I remember I spoke to who was the then president, Monsef Marzouki, and the then head of government, Rashid Ghannouchi, and they had utterly different opinions about how to deal with the jihadist threat. There was tremendous anxiety about a crackdown on jihadists, fearing that they would simply look like the new Ben Alis, the new dictatorship, and they weren't prepared to do that. And
right now there is this sort of feeling of national unity, obviously, in the wake of the attack, but there are some second-guessing, most notably saying that when the Islamists were in power, they may have given too much of a free pass to hardliners.
Absolutely. And I remember Ghannouchi actually saying to me in an interview, what do you want us to do, lock them up just because of their ideologies? Well, in a sense, yes. 2 years later, some would say maybe there ought to have been a big crackdown 2 years ago. When you talk to Tunisian officials now, they say that an awful lot of time has been lost simply not knitting together a good, capable security force.
Michael Young, do you agree?
Yes, I agree. One thing about this that has actually intrigued me is suddenly we're speaking about the Islamic State as being this broad multinational organization. I think that needs to be qualified a little bit. It's a brand, and people are attaching themselves to this brand. But I find...
So, for instance, when there's the attack, this horrific attack this Friday in Yemen's capital, with at least 140 Shiites killed at Friday prayer, there isn't some grand strategy linking that and what happened in Tunis on Wednesday?
I think even to assume a sort of an organic link between Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in Raqqa, in Syria, and in Libya is a bit of a stretch. You know, these are not countries next to each other. So what you seem to have is what you had after the, you know, you had a decade and a half ago. You have these groups that are emerging for local reasons and who suddenly attach themselves to this sort of multinational brand. It used to be Al-Qaeda, now it's ISIS. I mean, this is something to investigate, I think.
Judah Grunstein.
Well, especially because there are two things. What you said is exactly right. There are perhaps individual links, people who have been to Syria and come back. But in terms of some sort of centralized planning operation, and that's what makes these kinds of attacks so difficult here in Paris or in Tunis, is that there's a trend towards lone wolf attacks or two-people attacks, small commando attacks like this. These can be planned by the people independently with a little bit of training, very little training, and very little weapons or equipment. So it makes it very hard, even for a very capable security force like the French military and the domestic police to counter. The thing, too, about Tunisia is that, unlike in, for instance, Egypt, the Tunisian military was always kept very weak and poorly equipped by Ben Ali because he always feared it. So they're starting in some ways from scratch. They have a pretty bad problem on the western border with Algeria. And now apparently there's a problem in terms of infiltration from Libya. So I think in terms of that, there's going to be a need for international cooperation to try and build up a professional security force that doesn't then run the risk of overstepping its bounds and leaning into a dictatorship.
It's early days for the investigation. It's all speculation at this point. What we have to go on is the profiles of these two attackers, men in their 20s, disenfranchised Tunisians. Would you say, Delphine, that this has more to do with what happened here in Paris 2 months ago or with what happened in Yemen today?
I think, as everybody mentioned, it works like more than like a network, more than someone giving orders to attack here and there. And you were mentioning Tunisia, where the army is weak, but we see it. I live now in Cairo, and we see that even in Egypt, the army, which is supposed to be so strong, I mean, don't forget Marshal Sisi, who became the president, and he's actually running the country more on a security level than a political level. And he's struggling, and he's fighting, and he has a hard time fighting terrorism. In Sinai, where recently, indeed, as well, some of the jihadis claim themselves as followers of ISIS, but not all of them. And in the meantime, so you have this huge threat in the Sinai. In the meantime, in the last 2 months, I would say, we saw some new groups emerging with different names as like Molotov, Popular Resistance, Punishment. And these groups are totally different from ISIS. It's more like a daily system of putting bombs, targeting the Vodafone stores, for instance, or some banks. So the question is, yes, what will happen in the coming months and the coming years if those guys start following the jihadis in Sinai and become more and more experimented? Then we may face the same kind of attack in Cairo as we just saw in Tunis.
All right, we're going to move on and tell you that, boy, did the pollsters get it wrong in Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu cashing in with a win that puts him on course to be that country's longest-serving prime minister, beating out the center-left with a late pitch to the hard right, vowing never to recognize a Palestinian state, warning on election day of hordes of Arab citizens bust in to vote by outside forces. Add to that, of course, his March 3rd speech at the invitations of Republicans in the U.S. Congress. Netanyahu knew there'd be fence-mending to do with the Obama White House. It started the day after the vote on Wednesday with a partial retraction on a two-state solution. But he said, Netanyahu, I haven't changed my policy. I never retracted my speech of 6 years ago calling for a demilitarized Palestinian state that recognizes the Jewish state. What has changed, he says, is the reality that even though Obama and Netanyahu have now spoken on the phone, that doesn't mean all is forgiven.
What is apparent is that in the context of the campaign, and while he was the sitting prime minister of Israel, he walked back from commitments that Israel had previously made to a two-state solution.
And by the way, Judah, this goes further now with news that the Republican Speaker of the House is going to be accepting an invitation to go to Israel before the end of the month.
It sounds like a love fest between the Republican Congress and Netanyahu. What's interesting is that, to begin with, it's not necessarily clear that he'll be able to form a government because the right-wing bloc is not necessarily...
Really? Is there really suspense on that?
He still needs to win a couple votes, a couple members over before he has a solid majority. And the question is how stable the president of Israel believes that majority is. What's interesting, too, is then after that, it's a question of forming his government and the symbolic nominations of different people to different portfolios. The negotiations between the Obama administration and Netanyahu have already begun because the Obama administration essentially, I'm not sure if it was a declaration or a leak, has already made it clear that they're reevaluating the diplomatic cover they're willing to give
by the White House press
at the UN Security Council, and they're watching very closely the government that Netanyahu decides to form, and that will impact their decision about how much they're willing to veto or just abstain from various Security Council votes. So clearly, there's a lot left. There's still a lot more in terms of where the chips fall in terms of the story before we know exactly what to expect in terms of the arm wrestling match that's going to be going on.
All right, I'm going to ask the rest of our panel whether it's just bruised egos at this point or whether there is a fundamental change going on in U.S.-Israel relations. Stay with us. You're watching The World This Week.